저는 존 워커입니다. 맥쿼리 한국 회장입니다. 만수 반갑습니다. Now, if you don't mind, I will switch to English. 학생입니다. I'm really delighted to be here today. This is a subject which is quite close to my heart after many years in the financial sector. What I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about Macquarie, mainly to draw some parallels between the development of my company and the regulatory environment that we were born with. I then want to talk about, briefly, because I think Professor Kim has covered the definitions of rules-based versus principle regulation very well and very thoroughly. Then I want to describe what the Australian financial markets look like. So I want to describe what kind of financial industry the Australian principles-based regulatory environment has helped create. And then at the conclusion to talk a little bit about what could be in Korea. When I'm speaking, there's three things that I'd like you to bear in mind. And one of those things is that there's a very clear connection between growing successful financial institutions and a financial market and the regulatory environment. Regulators and the financial sector need to work as partners to produce great financial institutions and industry. That's the first thing I'd like you just to think about. The second thing I'd like you to think about is the importance of people. Actually, the finance sector's not just balance sheets, buildings, computers, it's about people. So, considering the impact of regulatory change on human capital and the need to develop human capital in line with that change is extremely important. Then the third thing I'd like you to bear in mind is that regulation is a living thing. Regulation shouldn't be something that you just draft and put in the rule book and then get on with life. It has to be able to develop. It has to be able to grow, and this means a huge amount of cooperation between industry and policymakers. So I think this point about regulation being a living thing is an important point. So just moving, that's a very old photograph of me, so we'll move on from there. Just in terms of Macquarie, we're a diversified financial institution, as you can see there. We were originally a UK investment bank back in the 60s. So we began operating as Macquarie just in 1985, and we were only listed in 1996. So we're quite a young organisation. That sounds better. Just in terms of our diversification, you'll see there our scale, I guess. Our current market cap is $30 billion, and our assets under management are just under $500 billion, and we're now in 27 different countries with about 70 offices. And fortunately, our annuity-style businesses count for around 70% of our profit. And you see that we've also been able to maintain our S&P rating for the last 26 years, when our competitors have tended to move around a little bit. Just in terms of our financial position, we are a very conservative institution, and as you can see there, we've been able to maintain a very healthy surplus capital, in addition to a very healthy mix of the nature of that capital. We have a number of operating groups, some annuity-style businesses, which are our asset management business, our leasing businesses, and banking and financial services. And then we have the market-facing businesses of commodities, global markets, and Macquarie Capital. Of those businesses, all of them, except for banking and financial services, are here in Korea. And one of the things we're well known for is infrastructure and infrastructure investing, and you'll see that There's a very, very, very significant portfolio of investments in infrastructure globally. And to give you a picture of the nature of those investments, this is what we operate and own around the world. And you'll see there's quite a long list of investments here in Korea on that slide. I just wanted to make the point about, I guess, our business resilience, and you can see where I have the letters in red that they were periods of quite significant market disruption. So you can see whether it was the recession in the 1970s, the currency crisis in 1972, the recession in 1990, the global real estate crash in 1981. We've tended to grow our business in times of disruption, and this, if you like, creativity and innovation is an important result of the nature of the regulatory regime in our home market. The other thing that's interesting is our growth is tracked against some very significant developments and changes to regulation. So, for example, back in 1981, we had the Campbell Report, which started the process of rationalising Australia's regulation. I was going to use the word deregulation, but I think Professor Kim's definition of rationalising regulation is a very good definition. And then from the period of around 2001, we saw a lot of global developments, but one of the great developments in Australia was the passing of our financial services legislation. And you can see again, our business tends to track well against these regulatory changes. And one of the interesting things about this slide, and these are the profit figures you can see, is that generally speaking, our profit in any one year, 40% of our profit in any one year comes from businesses that we did not have 5 years ago. And this is this point about creativity and innovation being very important to continued development and survival of financial institutions. In Korea, just a snapshot, we've been in Korea for 17 years. I've been here for 17 years, and as you can see, we have around 220 people across our businesses, and in terms of our investments, we have around 4,000 employees across Korea. It's a very, very important business for us, and one that we have a very long-term commitment to. As you can see here, these are the various businesses that we have operating in Korea, and I'm happy to say that continues to grow. So just turning now to the background of Australian regulations. This whole process started in 1981 with the Campbell Report, and following this report, two very important things happened. One is we floated the Australian dollar, and I'll talk a little later about the impact of that change, and began the process of rationalising the financial service regulations. Leading up to the period of 1997, we then had the Wallace Report, and that introduced a streamlined approach to financial services regulation, and it led to the establishment of the twin regulators, as we call them in Australia, of ASIC and APRA. And really those two reports and the action flowing from them set a period of 30 years of growth and innovation and significant scaling up of the financial sector in Australia. Through to 2001, which was really the culmination of all of those previous reviews commissioned by the government, and brought about the Corporations Act 2001, the Financial Services Reform Act 2001, which establishes the principle-based regulatory system in Australia. In 2013, and this is my point about regulation being a living thing, there was yet another review by David Murray, who was the previous Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which again began to strengthen more the resilience of the system, stressed again the importance of principle-based regulation, improve the efficiency of our retirement investment system, and set about to stimulate more innovation in the financial system. And some of the later developments there, despite some market failures or institutional failures, have not led to a challenging of the principles-based system, but rather putting more emphasis on accountability and more emphasis on penalties. And of course, one of the great strengths of the principle-based system is that the penalties are very strong indeed. So, and just to give a flavour, I guess, for the importance of this link between regulation and the financial sector, in the Wallace report, its final report, they made the point that regulation continues to be a strong driver of change in the finance industry, influences the actions of consumers and participants, and in turn influences the structure of the industry. So I think the design and philosophy of financial regulation is absolutely fundamental to the overall achievements of a nation's financial industry. Professor Kim touched in great detail on the differences between the two systems. And of course, the principles-based approach relies more on broad and general principles and focuses more on the outcome of the regulation, and then opposite to the rules-based approach, which is relying more on detailed and specific requirements and more prescription. The usual case in Commonwealth countries is a blend of the two, but with a lot of emphasis on the principle-based system. And here is just an example, very simple example of principle versus rule. A principle rule: do all things necessary to ensure the provision of honest and fair financial services, contra to something very prescriptive, such as a firm must do A, B, or Z. And of course, the question there, if there's no violation to those rules, where is their real market regulation and where are the penalties? I think the Australian government uses this in a number of sectors. There's the privacy protection under the Privacy Act, the accounting laws under IFRS, and anti-money laundering. So right across sectors in the Australian market, there tends to be a more principle-based approach than rules-based approach. And in the financial sector, there are basically 11 principles for financial firms under the Corporations Act, with very, very strong ex-post penalties on breaches of these principles, rather than the numerous ex-ante prohibitions that you might see in a rule-based system. So here are the 11, and you can see they're quite high level, but these are very serious obligations that Australian financial sectors use to guide their internal decision-making, their internal compliance policies and procedures, and the development of their human capital. So you can see that these are quite high level, but very, very much fostering an outcome-focused approach. ASIC promotes this regulatory autonomy to encourage market innovation. So the regulator sees they're responsible and formally has their responsibility of fostering innovation. And this of course has been very, very important to the development of our financial industry, and I will talk some more about that later. So how to apply those principles, and this is the key, how these principles are applied is really for the financial firms to decide. So this is giving the industry room for financial innovation and development, so long as they do so within the boundaries of those principles. So I guess the way to think about it, the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, but within very clear principle boundaries. And it really achieves these objectives through promoting consumer trust and confidence, and bringing about penalties for the principles being breached. So the ASIC applies a detect, understand and respond approach. One of the important things is the understanding of the environment that they are in by scanning the market and scanning the market participants. And I made that point, and applying an ex-post penalty scheme. So this principles-based approach enables ASIC to impose penalties on misbehaviours that are not explicitly stated in the rule book. And the reality of practice has been is that many of the penalties that ASIC has imposed on Australian financial institutions have not been prescribed in law. They have not. This is an industry that moves very quickly. So principles-based approach, ironically, relative to a rule-based approach, provides the opportunity to preemptively deal with market practices that are not appropriate as they arise, without the need for continual rule changes. And some examples of this sort of outcome I have here is from 2010 to 2012, a number of Australian banks were manipulating the bank bill swap reference rate to minimise their losses, maximise their profits. There were no specific rules breached in doing this, but they were able to be regulated and penalised as contravention of the bank's obligations as a licensee under the principles-based scheme. So several banks have chosen to make some voluntary contributions. One of those banks is now under civil proceedings in the federal court. But here's a good example of a law that could not be foreseen being addressed through a principles regulation scheme. And that in Europe, the experience with LIBOR was a very, very similar experience where there were not specific rules around index rigging, but under the principle-based systems, there was an opportunity to address those malpractices. So just to touch on the Australian regulatory model, we've got a Twin Peaks model, ASIC, which is responsible for market conduct and for consumer protection, and then APRA, which is responsible for financial system stability. So they have very different rules, but work in partnership to oversight the system. And they have complementary roles with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission and the Reserve Bank of Australia. In terms of how we, as an Australian-based financial institution, work within this principles-based system, we have three principles, with principles of opportunity, accountability, and integrity. And this is my point about human capital. They form the basis for all behaviours and actions. And these are very consistent with the 11 principles under the regulatory regime that I spelled out earlier. This point about individual accountability is very, very important. The model that has tended to grow in Australia is a model where not just the compliance officer and not just the potential officer is responsible for appropriate behaviour, but that every staff member in the financial institutions also has the role as a compliance officer. So under these systems, the way they develop, all staff members tend to own the business and own their responsibility to appropriate behaviour. It's a very different system if you're giving staff a series of 20 rules. And you see how this very proactive approach in terms of being vigilant for new and unexpected risks and adverse consequences, and fair dealing is fundamentally responsible. All of our staff fundamentally responsible. So my point is here that under the principles-based approach, the financial institutions themselves begin to change the way in which they manage risk and manage behaviour. And it's been very successful for us over our 48-year history. So that's just briefly the situation in Australia. And in terms of Australian financial markets growth, I made the point that the government responded to these inquiries over the years, and in doing so have really, through their financial policies, underpinned a period of unprecedented growth. And as I mentioned, that started with the floating of the Australian dollar, which was really a key event in Australia's financial development. And at about that time, the rationalisation of regulation was a fundamental change which led companies such as mine to grow not only domestically, but to grow internationally. Under the regime of flexibility and transparency, we found that within our organisation and other Australian financial institutions, a lot of innovation to remain competitive, and a lot of ability for each different business line to be able to work cooperatively to develop new products, which of course is very, very difficult under a strict Chinese wall system, such as the system we see here in Korea. So the Australian financial landscape, in terms of what it now looks like, it's relatively consolidated and dominated by quite a small number of large organisations. And as you see there, we have 4 major banks, and each of these has a market cap of over $80 billion. I think the Commonwealth Bank's probably at around $100 billion market cap. And this consolidation has been happening steadily over the years. There are some very significant regional banks and quite a number of building societies and credit unions, which are mainly unlisted, and then quite a large number of subsidiaries of foreign banks. So it's a quite consolidated sector. And similarly, with the Australian non-life sector, it's a very rational and consolidated market, with the top 3 players accounting for nearly 60% of the market share. Both the majority of the life insurers and the fund managers of any scale sit within a major bank, or they are foreign owned. So in the Australian market, the only remaining investment bank of any scale is actually Macquarie. So this period of change has been very interesting in terms of solidifying our position. You'll see here that over the last 30 years, the financial services sector has become one of the largest sectors within the Australian Stock Exchange. And this has been one of the fundamental reasons for Australia's success as an economy over the years. A very large part of the economy is the services sector, and the largest part of the services sector is the financial sector. And this has been extremely important to our growth and economic health. And you can see that in compared with the other sectors, the financial sector is one of the largest sectors within the stock exchange. So if you can see here the moves from 1992 to 2012, and predictably manufacturing shrinking from 14% to 7%, but finance growing from 6% to 10%. So the economy is relatively well balanced. And I think it's probably surprising for many people to know that the financial sector is as big as the mining sector. So most people's impressions of Australia is that the mining sector is overwhelmingly. So as I think about Korea, it will be interesting to see manufacturing and finance and their relative growth over the next 10 years, and hopefully with Korea moving to a principle-based system, we'll see some of these same dynamics happening in our market here. I think the other thing that's come about for Australia is that it has a great reputation as a friendly and an efficient environment for doing business. And obviously the form of regulation is really fundamental to that impression. And that environment and that impression fosters a lot of foreign investment, and obviously fosters a lot of confidence on the part of investors that are allocating their capital into the Australian market. So again, this point about openness and transparency and flexibility of regulation can have implications far beyond just a financial institution growing. And this sounds a little bit like skiting, but Australia's financial system is really regarded as one of the ones with the greatest quality in the world. Now, we couldn't have said that 30 years ago. We couldn't have said that under our previous regulatory regime in the finance sector. We had a disjointed, overprescribed sector that was which was not growing. But we see the result of those changes that I went through earlier transferring through into where it sits now. And of course, what all of this means is when a system is recognised as being sophisticated, and if there's a substantial finance sector in the economic mix, this provides access to capital. This provides an ability to access, well, you see in this case, for Australia at this time, nearly 4 times our country's nominal GDP. So that's a huge depth of $6.2 trillion in the financial sector. And I guess the other thing which is very important, and this growth has followed the growth of our financial sector, and being a very important part of that growth is the pool of funds under management. And these are primarily from the superannuation funds, or the pension funds, in the government fostered pension fund system in Australia. And of course, to give that system the confidence to grow and to develop, the nature of financial regulation has been extremely important. The ability of financial institutions to work across businesses to develop innovative product and creative product have been a very important ingredient to the growth of successfully invested national savings. And of course, the other thing that can result from this dynamic and of scale financial sector is market turnover. And in Australia's case, for some time now, this has really been surging. The amount of turnover in the market has been surging. And again, this all relates back to the confidence that the community, the investment community, will place in its financial sector. And as you can see there, the free float, Australia, surprisingly to some, is the largest liquid stock market in Asia outside Japan. And that, again, brings us back to the importance of the underpinnings of the broader financial sector. And I'm making these points just to demonstrate the importance and the significance of the regulatory change to the development of this sector. The implications can move well beyond just growing a big bank or just internationalising a bank. They can go to the foundations of the country's economy. This is an interesting slide as well, in that Australia is a regional leader in the issuance of international domestic debt securities, and of course this comes from the scale and the expertise that sits within the sector. So just to conclude, I think the lessons from Australia, similar to other countries, is that the principle-based approach has provided industry participants with a great platform to innovate and to grow. It is a living regulated system, so there has been some failings recently, but instead of challenging the principles-based system, the emphasis has come a little more onto accountability and to penalties. And as I'm saying here, it follows that for Korea to become a more active participant in international financial services and to attract more investment and participation, it really should move its regulatory scheme more towards the global standard. It's very difficult for countries, financial sectors and regulators to cooperate if one system has a series of rules and the other is principle-based. And of course, this is a global industry. So I'm very optimistic in hearing what I'm hearing this morning from the various congressmen and other speakers, that as Korea moves along the path towards achieving its principle-based regulatory system, that we can continue to grow our business here. And as a long-term Korean resident, I can see the economy broaden and strengthen. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.